A container ship the length of 4 football fields slides into the first lock chamber at 5 in the morning, guided by a man who spent 9 years training to do exactly this. The captain of that vessel, the person legally in command at sea, hands over navigational control of a ship carrying hundreds of millions of dollars in cargo and watches from the bridge while someone else steers it through 51 miles of waterway. He has no legal authority to object. Every transit through the Panama Canal costs a standard container ship somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 in toll fees alone, and during peak congestion, shipping companies have paid auction premiums of up to $4 million extra just to skip the waiting line. In fiscal year 2023, the Panama Canal Authority collected approximately $3.35 billion in toll revenue, with total revenues reaching roughly $4.97 billion. That's roughly $14 million a day flowing into a single waterway in Central America. What nobody explains clearly, and what the Canal Authority buries several pages into its annual reports, is what it actually costs to keep a 51-mile passage through the jungle open, operational, and profitable, because that cost structure changes everything about what the revenue figures mean. We'll get to that. First, let's talk about what owning a canal actually is. A shipping canal isn't a port. A port can be built anywhere you pick a coastline, pour concrete, build cranes, and open for business. A canal is geography that cannot be replicated, because geography is fixed. There are 2 places on the map where the geometry of the continents creates a choke point that every major Atlantic to Pacific trade route, or Europe to Asia route, has to cross. One is the narrow land bridge connecting North and South America. The other is the strip of Egypt separating the Mediterranean from the Red Sea. The Panama Canal sits on the first one. The Suez Canal sits on the second. Together they handle a combined share of the world's seaborne trade that makes them, in any honest economic sense, the most valuable pieces of infrastructure on Earth. When ships can't use them, because of a drought, a war, a grounded vessel, a political dispute, the global effects show up within days. Cargo prices rise. Factory deliveries slip. Fuel costs spike. Every container ship rerouted around the southern tip of South America adds roughly 9,000 extra nautical miles, 2 extra weeks at sea, and fuel bills that dwarf what the toll would have cost. The canal doesn't need to advertise. You come to it, you pay what it charges, and you do it again next quarter. That dynamic, that captive customer business model, is the reason the story of who built these canals, who controls them, and who actually profits from them is one of the most consequential ownership stories in modern economics. It starts, as most expensive mistakes do, with a Frenchman who was very confident. Ferdinand de Lesseps built the Suez Canal, completed in 1869, and it was an engineering triumph. De Lesseps became one of the most celebrated men in Europe. So when a French company secured the rights to build a canal across Panama in 1881, he was the natural choice to lead it. He had done the impossible once. He planned to do it again. He did not. The Suez Canal was cut through flat desert at sea level. Panama was a different problem entirely, a mountain range sitting in the middle of a jungle, with rainfall levels that turned construction sites into rivers, and mosquitoes carrying diseases that nobody at the time fully understood. In 9 years of digging, the French company lost somewhere between 20,000 and 22,000 workers, most of them to yellow fever and malaria. The project went bankrupt in 1889. Gone. The equipment rusted in the jungle. The United States bought the remaining French assets and excavation work for $40 million in 1904 and started over with a completely different approach. The key difference wasn't manpower. It was a doctor named William Crawford Gorgas who implemented an aggressive mosquito eradication campaign across the entire construction zone, draining standing water, fumigating buildings, screening every ward. Disease deaths dropped by roughly 90%. Then the engineers made a decision that saved the entire project. They stopped trying to build a sea-level canal. Instead, they dammed the Chagres River, flooded a valley to create what was at the time the largest man-made lake in the world, Gatun Lake, and constructed a series of enormous waterlock chambers that would lift ships up over the mountains and lower them back down on the other side, using gravity and rainfall with no pumps required. The total construction cost for the American project came to approximately $375 million, the single most expensive construction project in United States history at that point, which in today's terms works out to somewhere in the range of $10 to $12 billion. It opened on August 15, 1914, 3 weeks into a world war that would immediately make its strategic value obvious. Official records count 5,609 deaths during the American construction phase. Combined with the French attempt, the total human cost of building the Panama Canal is estimated somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 lives. That number does not appear in the toll revenue reports. The canal that opened in 1914 had one major limitation built into its original engineering. It could only handle ships up to a certain size, now called Panamax vessels. For nearly a century, that constraint shaped global shipbuilding. Cargo ship designers worked around the lock chamber dimension. The lock chambers determined what you could move, what you could carry, and what you couldn't. Then the Panama Canal Authority spent $5.25 billion building a third set of locks alongside the originals. The new locks opened in June 2016, capable of handling vessels more than twice the width of what the original locks could accommodate. The container ship capacity moving through Panama roughly doubled overnight. The financing for that expansion came partly from retained canal revenues and partly from debt, and the Canal Authority's own annual operating budget now runs at approximately $5.21 billion, a figure that represents what it actually costs to run the world's most important waterway, before you start calculating what flows out the other side as surplus. Let's talk about how the tolls actually work, because the number on the invoice is not the number you'd expect. The Panama Canal charges ships based on a measurement unit called PCVUMS, the Panama Canal Universal Measurement System, which is essentially a standardized calculation of a vessel's cargo capacity. The larger the ship, the higher the rate per unit of capacity. A large container ship in a standard transit will typically pay somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 in basic toll fees, but the toll is only part of the bill. Every ship entering the canal is legally required to take on a Panama Canal pilot, one of roughly 250 licensed professionals who are the only people authorized to navigate vessels through the system. That's a mandatory service. It's billed separately. Tugboats are mandatory for larger vessels, line handlers, boarding fees, anchorage charges if you wait. By the time a large container ship has cleared the final lock and re-entered open ocean, the total canal charge, tolls plus mandatory services, is often closer to $500,000 per transit. For the canal, this is not a problem. For the shipping company, it is still cheaper than 2 extra weeks of fuel and crew costs on the Cape Horn route. Now, the operating costs. The Panama Canal Authority employs approximately 9,000 people. More than 250 of them are licensed pilots, each of whom went through a training program that takes roughly 9 years from initial entry to full qualification for the largest vessel classes. 9 years before the Canal Authority can put a pilot on a Neo-Panamax ship unsupervised. The pilot corps is the most critical single input in the system and the slowest one to scale. Beyond the pilots, you have tugboat crews, lock operators, maintenance engineers, dredge crews, hydrologists monitoring the water levels of 2 lakes that feed every lock on both sides of the continent, administrative staff, a maritime traffic control center, a police force, a fire department, and a separate environmental management division responsible for the watershed that supplies every gallon of water the locks run on. In fiscal year 2020, the Canal Authority budgeted approximately $350 million just for maintenance work, covering dredging, dam upkeep, spillway maintenance, and lock infrastructure. That's the maintenance budget, not salaries, not the cost of running more than 40 tugboats around the clock every single day. The full operating cost picture is embedded inside that approximately $5.21 billion annual budget. Revenue around $5 billion against costs around $5 billion leaves a margin that is real but not comfortable, and it is not guaranteed. What flows out to Panama's national treasury is whatever remains after all of that. In fiscal year 2025, the year ending September 30, 2025, the Panama Canal Authority transferred a record $2.965 billion to Panama's national treasury. Since the United States handed the canal back to Panama on December 31st, 1999, the deadline set by the Torrijos-Carter treaties signed in September of 1977, Panama has received over $31 billion in total canal contribution. $31 billion extracted from a 51-mile trench that cost $375 million to build, and which Panama did not pay for. The canal is, by some distance, Panama's most valuable economic asset. Its operating surplus funds national infrastructure, highways, metro lines, water projects. Canal contributions account for a substantial portion of Panama's entire government income. What the United States received in return for handing it over was a neutrality treaty that keeps the canal open to ships of all nations, including American Navy ships. The United States gave away one of the most profitable pieces of infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere and kept the access rights. Whether that was a fair deal depends entirely on whether you think a strip of American-controlled territory inside another country's sovereign land was ever going to hold indefinitely. It wasn't. The Suez Canal tells the same story from a different angle. Egypt saw the Suez Canal completed in 1869, built on Egyptian land but financed largely by French capital and constructed with Egyptian labor under conditions that were, by any honest description, coercive. The Suez Canal Company, headquartered in Paris, collected the tolls for decades. Egypt received a fraction. On July 26, 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser stood before a massive crowd in Alexandria and announced that Egypt was nationalizing the canal, taking full ownership. Effective immediately, Britain, France, and Israel launched a military operation to retake it in October and November of 1956. The United States forced them to stop, not out of sympathy for Egypt, but out of Cold War calculation. A visible act of Western military aggression in the Middle East would push Arab nations toward the Soviet Union. The invading forces withdrew. NASA kept the canal. The Suez Crisis is taught as a geopolitical turning point, the moment when Britain and France's status as global powers essentially ended, when the world understood that controlling a piece of infrastructure on someone else's territory was no longer a stable arrangement. What it was, more simply, is a demonstration that a canal's value isn't just the toll revenue. It's the fact that whoever controls it decides who passes through. That power is worth more than any annual revenue figure, which brings us to the part the canal's revenue reports cannot capture: the exposure. A canal is not a passive asset. It requires rain. The Panama Canal runs on fresh water from Gatun Lake, the man-made reservoir created when the Americans dammed the Chagres River in 1914. Every time a ship passes through a lock, it uses approximately 52 million gallons of fresh water, which drains out to sea. That water is replenished by rainfall. When the rainfall stops, the lake drops. When the lake drops, the canal has two options: restrict the draft, the depth to which ships are allowed to load, or reduce the number of daily transits. In late 2023, the El Niño drought hit Gatun Lake hard. The Canal Authority cut daily transits from the normal capacity of 36 to 38 vessels down to 22 per day. The allowable draft fell from 50 feet to 38.5 feet in the worst phase. Ships loaded to full capacity couldn't pass through. Shipping companies had to offload cargo before entry or reroute entirely around Cape Horn. In that same period, Panama Canal toll revenue fell from approximately $3.35 billion in fiscal year 2023 to approximately $3.18 billion in 2024. But the Suez Canal shows what real exposure looks like. That canal generated approximately $10.2 billion in revenue in calendar year 2023, a record high. In 2024, how the attacks in the Red Sea caused major shipping lines to reroute away from the canal entirely. Traffic dropped by roughly 50%. Revenue collapsed to approximately $3.9 billion. $6 billion in annual revenue. Gone. In 1 year. Not because the canal broke, because the waters leading to it became dangerous. A canal doesn't just compete with alternative routes. It competes with alternative realities. Wars, droughts, geopolitical crises that nobody scheduled, that no spreadsheet projected. So what does the actual bottom line look like? The Canal Authority's approved budget for fiscal 2025 to 2026 is approximately $5.21 billion, covering operations, maintenance, capital investment, and overhead. Total revenues in 2023 came to roughly $4.97 billion. In 2024, roughly $4.99 billion. The record treasury transfer of $2.965 billion to Panama's government in fiscal 2025 happened in a good year. Rain returned to Gatun Lake, daily high draft transits recovered to around 33 ships per day, and the auction premium system, where shipping companies bid extra hundreds of thousands of dollars for priority slots during congestion, continued generating significant non-toll income. In the bad years, the drought years, Panama's treasury receives substantially less, and the Canal Authority draws on accumulated reserves. This is not a passive income machine. It is a capital-intensive infrastructure business with a geographic monopoly, a fixed asset that cannot be expanded beyond what the surrounding watershed can support, and a customer base that genuinely has no cost-effective alternative. That captive customer dynamic is the reason the revenue holds even when operations are constrained. Shipping companies do not have the option of deciding canals are too expensive. Panama is not the only country to discover what canal ownership really means. Egypt receives Suez Canal revenues that, in a good year, represent a critical pillar of the country's foreign currency earnings. In 2023, that meant $10.2 billion. In 2024, it meant $3.9 billion. The gap between those 2 years was not a business decision. It was a proxy conflict in the Red Sea. 76% of the tonnage passing through Panama is connected to United States origin or destination trade. That one number explains why American political interest in the canal never fully disappeared after 1999. Let's build the actual ownership picture. You are not buying a ditch. You are buying a piece of geography, the legal monopoly on the most efficient route between two oceans, a trained workforce that took decades to assemble, a water management system depending on a watershed covering thousands of square kilometers, a diplomatic agreement with every major maritime nation, and the obligation to keep all of it running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, for every ship in the queue. The startup cost was $375,019,14. Somewhere around $10 to $12 billion in current terms. The expansion cost was $5.25 billion. The annual operating budget is approximately $5.21 billion, and that is before a drought cuts your revenue by $200 million, before a regional war cuts a competitor canal's revenue by 60% in a single year, before the political calculation shifts and the country you built the canal inside decides the arrangement is no longer acceptable. The Suez Canal was taken in a single speech. The Panama Canal took 22 years of treaty negotiations, a United States Senate vote that barely passed, and a transfer deadline set for midnight on December 31st, 1999. Canal ownership is not a financial instrument. It is a geopolitical commitment with a very long payback period and no reliable exit. The man piloting that container ship at 5 in the morning earned the authority to do so after 9 years of training. He boards the vessel, takes control from its captain, and guides something the size of a city block through a channel with clearances sometimes measured in single-digit feet. When he's done, he boards a small launch and rides back to the pilot station to wait for the next ship. The canal processes around 35 vessels on an average day. That's roughly 35 separate transit fees, 35 mandatory pilot assignments, 35 invoices that together add up somewhere between $10 and $15 million. Every day, every year, regardless of who technically holds the title to the land the water sits on. The United States spent nearly a century and several $billion to build and operate it. Panama has been depositing the revenue since midnight on December 31st, 1999. 25 years and over $31 billion ago, and somewhere in the anchorage off the Atlantic entrance right now, there is almost certainly a ship at anchor, paying charter costs that run into the tens of thousands of dollars a day, waiting for the cue to move. The captain already handed over the wheel. He doesn't get it back until the pilot steps off.